I don't know about you, but I have been struck by the incivility in the political advertising I'm seeing. That's a topic we discuss next when we talk about where has the civility gone. That's coming up on NewsNite. This is NewsNite, and I'm Jody Miller. Welcome to the 14th broadcast season of NewsNite here on Western Reserve PBS. While our panel discussion format, with which you may have become used to, has changed, what hasn't changed is our commitment to covering in depth the regional stories that are of importance to our communities. It's just this season, we're going to be going to the newsmakers behind those stories and making a difference in our communities. Well, it's September 7th, and it is our first broadcast. And it's the first Friday after the Labor Day holiday weekend. Well, the Labor Day holiday weekend is traditionally the start of the political campaign season for the November elections. And I don't know about you, but the campaign advertising has been pervasive already. The campaign ads that I'm seeing are nasty, mean-spirited, somewhat distorted, and downright mean. So the question is, where has civility gone? And who better to answer that question than a journalist, a political scientist, and a woman of the cloth. That's why we welcome to our panel tonight Dr. John Green, who is the Executive Director of the Bliss Institute of Applied Politics at the University of Akron, the Reverend Dr. Diana Swoope, who is the Senior Pastor at the Arlington Church of God and a well-respected member of the faith community, and Dan Moulthrop, who is, he's got the best title in the world, the Curator of Conversation at the Civic Commons, which is a way to bring people and communities together in conversation using technology.
That's right.
Thank you all so much for being here. So, is my premise correct at the beginning of the program? Are ads more pervasive and more mean-spirited, or am I just hypersensitive?
Well, they're certainly more pervasive. We've had a very extensive amount of campaign advertising here in the early going in the presidential campaign. Probably will set records in terms of the amount of money spent by both sides. But something I think that's very important is that the level occurred earlier this time than in past elections. You know, our campaigns have begun to start earlier and earlier, and this one seems like it's been going on for a long time now because, in fact, it has been. So there is a lot more of campaigning occurring, and I think most observers would agree that there's a really nasty edge to the campaigning we're seeing. Maybe not the nastiest in our history, but certainly a lot nastier than most people would like to see.
Which brings to the point of our discussion here, the Ohio Civility Project. What is it?
Well, John, you started this whole thing, John, so you should explain it, and then I'll jump in.
Well, the Ohio Civility Project is an attempt to first understand the perception that we all have that our political discourse has become less civil and more negative and less productive. But secondly, to do something about it, to work with people in the community and around the state to set some standards for civility. When you talk to people about civility, the first thing they say is, well, what do you mean by civility? I mean, I'm all for it, but give me the details. But then secondly, also track the level of incivility, if you will, in the campaigns and report to the public about what they're seeing so that there's some kind of more objective
measure of standards?
Some kind of measure of the standards. And so it's not just people's impression. There's actually some evidence that people can work with.
So John and his group, which is a consortium of universities, you've got Cleveland State University Levin, and then Mount Union College as well, and the University of Akron, they studied this last year, and then this year it's like, well, okay, now that we know what the problem is, let's do something about it. And I found out about this, and I thought, this is perfect, because it's not just the, as soon as I read your report, and even before any of this stuff had crystallized, I imagined that they could create a kind of PolitiFact for civility. So the way PolitiFact does these rates, does fact checking and then rates people's statements as either factually correct, mostly true, mostly true, and then all the way to liar, liar, pants on fire. That the Civility Project could do that, could get people together and rate the relative civility of public comments by campaigns, by campaign surrogates, and so forth. And then I always imagine, I don't know, John, if it's going to go this way, that it could be rated on a scale of unnecessary roughness, a 10-yard penalty, a 20-yard penalty, and so forth. But we haven't worked that part out yet.
Okay, well, Dan, you mentioned the University of Akron and the Bliss Institute and Mount Union University, and Cleveland State. Who else is involved in the larger scope of the Civility Project?
Well, early on, we became involved with representatives of the faith community because we felt that that community could really add something, both in terms of determining what civility is, but also in getting the message out to the broader community. So we've worked with a number of pastors here in town, very broad base in terms of their religious backgrounds. We've also linked up with the Beacon Journal because it turned out that they wanted to write a series of stories about why everybody was angry. And of course, that's not exactly the same thing, but it's closely connected to incivility because angry people tend to be uncivil.
And that's how I think this whole civility in terms of the politics comes into play in a larger atmosphere. That's how I got involved. As a pastor, I'm very concerned about how people respond to each other, how we respect one another. But I do agree that there is an angry spirit pervasive in the atmosphere. And I think the political campaigns are capitalizing on it, number one, but also exacerbating it, number two. And therefore, I feel very good about being a part of something that can at least help us to quantify what does it mean to be civil to each other, and how can we help you to understand that in a way that you can implement it into your life.
Is that primarily the goal of the whole Ohio Civility Project, is to quantify what civility is and to help more of us be more civil?
I think one of the goals first is to understand what civility actually is. You could ask the three of us right now, and we would probably have three different definitions. For me, civility means listening. It means paying attention to and respecting what other people believe and trying to understand what other people believe, and then expressing any dissent that I might have in a respectful manner. But Pastor Mark Ford, a friend of all of ours, describes it as just being nice. I think I got his voice pretty close there. Let's just be nice to each other. But I know that we all have a different sense of what that means, and so part of it is to come to a common understanding. That's one of the goals of the project.
And I understand you've written a civility code which will help to maybe provide guidance?
Yes, well, it's not quite finished yet, but we have a good draft of it, and we've circulated it in the community. Dan put it up on the Civic Commons, and we got a lot of really useful comment. Some of it was wordsmithing to make sure that we all understood what we were talking about. But there were a lot of very, very helpful suggestions, and we hope to have a more polished version of it soon, which we'll go back to the community with. But
Can you give us the unpolished version so we have an idea of what we're talking about?
One of the really interesting things here was something that came through over and over again with everyone we talked to was the idea of respect. And so our notion is that, at the moment, is that civility is a standard of respect towards other people and their opinions that's necessary for constructive dialogue and solving problems. So, it is about being nice and polite, but it's fundamentally about respecting other people in the process. And that goes to Dan's point about listening, and I think it also goes to the angry spirit that we just mentioned. Some of that anger is legitimate. How do you express it? What do you do something about that kind of anger? And so, but the key thing is that civility helps us solve problems. It's not for its own sake, as much as beneficial as that would be. It's really about a much more practical issue.
And I think he makes a very good point when he talks about some of the anger is valid. It's logical in regard to what is happening circumstantially. But how do you learn how to have a discourse about your anger and still not disrespect, demean, or defame someone's character or personhood? And I think a lot of people have simply not learned how to do that. We haven't learned that you can disagree without being disagreeable. We haven't learned that you can have a very different opinion from mine, but I can still be in fellowship with you. And I think that is something that faith community is certainly involved with, but a project like this and just all of us coming to some type of common understanding of what does it really mean to respect? What does it really mean to listen? I think it's got to start very much earlier than what we do. There used to be in public schools the curriculum about character development, right. But it's got to begin there. Yet I don't think it's too late to start talking to adults about how do you get your angst out without being so mean-spirited.
Well, and to take it even a step further, how will this civility code impact and the campaigns coming up that we're going to be all part of in the next 2 months?
Well, we have high hopes for that. I mean, you've seen with PolitiFact that, I saw it in the paper this morning, actually. Sherrod Brown was referencing PolitiFact and the rating of his opponent in the race, Josh Mandel, in the race for U.S. Senate, and was saying, well, anyone with a PolitiFact score of X, obviously you can't think blah, blah, blah. So he's referencing that. If we can get the same kind of traction with the Civility Index and say, look, and be able to not only show when people are being uncivil, but also spotlight and highlight acts of real civility in public discourse during debates and so forth, then I think we'll come a long way. If candidates are saying, can do that with PolitiFact and say, look at my PolitiFact rating, we can't wait to see when they're saying, look at my Civility Index rating.
Well,
that would be great.
Is that in fact going to be the teeth, so to speak, of making this work and making politicians maybe a little more aware of how they need to be civil with each other?
I think there's a real good prospect that it will. All of us, and particularly people in politics, respond to incentives. And one way to get people to respond is to give them strong incentives, right? To avoid a low score and get a high score. And we understand that this isn't rocket science, right? This is all a matter of opinion. But we think that if we draw upon a great diversity of evaluators who will look at these statements and apply these common standards, that this can give politicians and their supporters incentives to behave in a better fashion.
How are you going to get this out to the public, though? I mean, Reverend Swoope, obviously, can you talk about this from the pulpit and hope to have an influence on congregations?
Absolutely. I can speak about the generalization in terms of civility in politics, taking a look at the candidates for whom you are considering for office, and seeing and determining how are they behaving with each other, and how does that impact your consideration of their abilities to operate in the political office that they're seeking. I think once politicians understand that the people they serve or are supposed to serve are looking at how are they behaving, not just what legislatures laws are you putting forth, but what's your character, because that's going to speak to how you vote or how you move or how you act once you do get in office. So I think it could have some real benefit and perhaps, as was said, provide incentive for us to look a little bit more closely at what we're doing to get to where we want to go.
And in addition to speaking from the pulpit, and in addition to the Civic Commons serving as one vehicle for publicizing this effort, the Akron Beacon Journal, our partners there, Doug Oplinger, the managing editor, and Bruce Wingus, the editor-in-chief, have really committed to publicizing these efforts, and your viewers will start seeing stories about these ratings in the pages of the Akron Beacon Journal twice a week very soon.
Well, what I want to do is continue this discussion on NewsNite.net and then come back and ask all of you a little bit more about civil discourse.
For more NewsNite content, including extended discussions, full interviews, and the chance to speak your mind about the issues, join us online at NewsNite.net.
But we're going to continue our discussion here, and I want to talk a little bit about civility and civil discourse. Let's talk a little bit more about what is civil discourse. Dan?
We have at thecivicommons.com, civility is one of the principles that guides our work. And when you create an account at the Civic Commons, you wind up actually checking off a box that says, I agree to uphold these principles. And one of them is civility. And we define it as I care as much about others' opinions as I care as much about learning about other people's opinions as I do expressing my own, and I act like it.
Are people who post are they anonymous?
No.
Okay, because does the anonymity have something to do with a lack of civility?
I believe it does.
Absolutely. If I can stay behind, if I can throw a rock and hide my hand, I'm going to get the biggest boulder I can find. If I'm looking to take you out, or if I'm looking to express an opinion that I feel would be not accepted if I came out front. So I think anonymity, definitely. And when you make a person have to sign their name or identify themselves, I think they'll be a lot more honest and ready to be a little less aggressive and forceful in what they say.
John, what is it about politics that seems to bring out the uncivil among us?
Well, I think there's two features to politics. One is politics is inherently about conflict. We have competitive elections, we try to construct majorities, different interests try to advance their concerns. So it's inherently about conflict. That doesn't mean that the conflict can't be very productive. In fact, we know from our history it can be very productive. But so part of the reason that incivility comes up in politics is because of the inherent nature of it. But the other thing about our politics is that it tends to channel what's going on in society broadly. As was mentioned earlier, sometimes politicians make it worse, but oftentimes they simply reflect the tensions and anger and problems that are out there in the community. And we have a lot of that these days. We have a lot of economic problems. We have a lot of disagreements about values. We have an increasingly diverse society where people don't see eye to eye on a lot of things. So there's a lot of disagreement that just naturally shows up in politics. Now, it doesn't just show up in politics. I mean, it shows up, I'm sure, in churches, shows up in schools. I see it up at the university. We see it online. So politics isn't the only place. But because of the nature of politics, it tends to absorb a lot of that and replicate it.
I think also that politics involves everyone. It impacts everyone, and that's one of the reasons why that it has such an ability to get involved in the emotions and the aspects of people's lives. Politics is not only inherently about conflict, but it's as John said, but it's inherently about change, and people hate change. They want change, but they hate what it takes to change. And as a consequence, I've got to decide how much of my comfort zone is going to be impacted by what you are proposing. And the more it is impacted, the more angry or the more difficult I will become about that. And I think that's one of the reasons also that politics brings about such animosity, conflict, because it is going to impact me directly and cause me to make some changes in some way, either 2 cents more in my taxes or whatever that may be. And as a result, most of us think about me. Let's just be honest. We think about
human nature.
And I appreciate that. I wish all the money would flow. We think about ourselves first, and we think about how is this going to impact me, bottom line. It could have a great impact for the good upon a lot of other people, but if it's going to negatively impact me, you have some issues, and we're going to have some issues. And so I think that's another reason why politics gets kind of at the heart of all of this in terms of the anger, et cetera.
You know, and the other piece, too, is that politics is essentially this very public conversation, this ongoing public dialogue. And that's why incivility in politics matters more than it matters in other places. It also matters online. It also matters in other places. But there's a big difference between Congressman Joe Wilson shouting, "You lie," and John, please remind me who it was who said to Senator McCarthy, "Have you at long last, sir, no decency," which is a very civil way of expressing disagreement and very pointed disagreement, but it's still civil rather than shouting "you lie" at the president.
Well, and Dan, you had a wonderful blog that you posted on HuffPost that we're going to put on our website, and it's called Incivility Matters. And what I'd like to talk about is, yeah, it matters, but I want to take it even a step further because it matters in terms of our entire democracy and the way this country is going to move forward. So can you address that?
Yeah, the point that I was trying to make in that is that, we get into these conversations often. People will say, oh, it's not nearly as bad as it used to be. Our founding fathers solved their differences with duels, hardly a civil way of solving problems, right? I agree. The reason it matters now is because it's so ubiquitous. We see it all the time. We read it all the time. We hear it all the time.
Do we become used to it, and then all of a sudden
we become completely used to it, and we become and then we take it on as a mode of discourse. That I don't have to be civil because nobody's civil these days. Who cares, right? And then that's a toxic thing. That's a poison, and we bring it into our own psyches, into our own emotional lives, and we go to bed at night thinking about somebody online who made some comment in some story that we disagree with, but he was so mean, and we don't need to do that. We don't need to do that to ourselves. That's not to say there's not time for incivility, or civil disobedience, or protesting, or being angry, but when it comes time to have a conversation, and where the object of the conversation is to find a solution or to come to an understanding, civility is a great starting place.
But is that what's happening in let's say, our federal government at this point? It's like Congress, you continually hear people saying Congress doesn't get anything done. Is it because bipartisanship has become a bad word?
Well, I think it has become a bad word. Of course, our government was not designed to move rapidly, so it's actually always hard to get things done, even under the best circumstances. But you don't have to look very far in the past to have a whole group of leaders, Republicans and Democrats, who were famous for working across the aisle on particular issues. They were very well known for that. A lot of people probably don't remember this, but back prior to the 1960 election, two of the fastest friends in the United States Senate were John F. Kennedy and Barry Goldwater. Hard to think of two people of that era that had more different politics, but they got along very well, and they wanted to work together on the issues where they could come together. And people like that still exist, but they're rare. And I think we've been recruiting some people for office, in both parties, to whom getting along is not a high priority. Not because they're bad people, but because they conclude that it just doesn't work. And unfortunately, that does have this broader impact on the process, because things we can all agree are important, we can't resolve.
Well, not only that, but we find ourselves with legislators like a Steve LaTourette, who's known for working across the aisle and trying to get things done. What does incivility do to our ability to put people in positions of power who are going to legislate for us?
Well, they resign, as Steve LaTourette did.
But that impacts us so terribly.
Right. If somebody asked you, Jody, would you care to run for Steve LaTourette's old seat? You'd call up Congressman LaTourette and you'd say, is there any reason why I should consider this? And he would say, no, it's terrible. That's what he told the plain dealer 2 months into the job 16 years ago. He said, it sucks. It's a really toxic atmosphere there, but it can change. I believe it can change. I believe it can't. We're not talking about a 180-degree change. We're talking about just moving the needle a little bit so people can say, yeah, I'm going to go with the Republicans on this, or yeah, I'm going to go with the Dems on this, and that's not terrible because it's about a solution. And if the public can say, yay, compromise. Imagine the public applauding compromise, not our side won. That would be great.
I think some of the things we're seeing, though, in the broader, especially on the federal level, is not just Dems and Democrats, Republicans. I think it's become personal, if we take that out of the equation, we would probably get to a greater level of civility. But when it becomes personal, when you have decided that you don't like a person, and then ideologies go out of the window. You're not able to really discourse about things that matter, about issues, because it's personal now. So anything that comes out of your mouth, anything that you say, anything that you seek to give progression to, I'm going to be against because I don't like you. And how do we, I'm not sure how we get beyond that, but without getting beyond that, I don't see civility coming.
I have one other question here because we're unfortunately running out of time here, but before I get to the very end, what role does the media, do the media play in this whole equation? Because do they exacerbate the situation? Do they look to sell and sensationalize, sell papers or advertising because they can sensationalize this?
We're totally complicit. The media is totally complicit in all of this. It does sell. The incivility sells as much as, if it bleeds, it leads. If somebody's gotten politically beaten up, that sells, right? And if
well, look at Troy Aiken.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
Congressman Aiken's a good example of that.
Not Troy Aiken, Congressman Aiken. Thank you.
Yeah.
Troy is the football player.
Congressman Aiken is a good example, and what happened to him is a good example. What happens every day, Harry Reid accusing Mitt Romney of not having paid taxes in a very civil manner, only to bait the GOP surrogates to calling him a dirty liar. I mean, it's great, and we play it out for days and days and days. The media needs to start demanding real answers. And explaining to the public why real answers are important, why all of that is much more important than the horse race.
Mm-hmm. We've got about 2 minutes left here, so I want each of you, if you would, to address this question. Can the Civility Project, the Ohio Civility Project, affect change long term? And why is it important that we do so? Reverend?
I believe it can, but we have to stick with it. We have to be consistent with it and continue to help people to understand the purpose behind that, and that is just to help us get along even at the base level, not just in politics, but in life itself. And as we go along, I think it can have a long-term impact across the board. And I'm very, very appreciative of the start, and we just have to continue to build on it.
One of the things the Akron Beacon Journal is, and I can't speak for them, but I think this is an important thing to add to the conversation. They are going to the candidates and the campaigns and saying, here's our civility code. The community has developed this. Would you abide by it? And they're reporting that. They're reporting what's happening in those conversations and whether or not candidates and campaigns are agreeing to go along with it. When that happens, I believe that, yes, that can have a great impact because it immediately becomes a point in the campaign, a decision the campaigns are making to either say we will be civil or we won't be civil, and then it's something that the public can then ask about at debates and in other places.
John?
I believe that it can make a big difference. It won't happen overnight, but I think the most valuable thing about it is it gives people who are concerned about what they perceive as a lack of civility in life in general, including politics, something to do about it. They've got standards to talk about. They've got standards that they can apply. They've got something they can do about it. And I think that's very important. It gives people a lot of hope that maybe someday this will work a lot better.
Well, I am hoping to see some changes in the next 2 months as we go through the campaign season. And I want to invite all of you back after the campaign election, the election, so that we can talk about this. Thank you all for being with us. It was a very enlightening conversation, and I'm grateful. And thank you for joining us on Newsnight. Good night.